Resentment does not announce itself. It waits. Silent, patient, it lives in the shadows of love, growing sharper with every kindness ignored, every wound denied, and when it finally emerges, it doesn't just scare, it consumes. What if the same emotion that begins as love is destined to rot into something far darker? Love. Humanity has exalted it as the highest of virtues, the most sacred of emotions, the very thread that holds our fragile existence together. It has been celebrated in poetry, canonized in scripture, immortalized in art, but hidden beneath its radiance lies a shadow we seldom acknowledge. For love is not merely tenderness or devotion, it is a force as volatile as fire. And where fire burns brightest, the ashes of resentment often lie in waiting. The paradox is ancient and unsettling. The deeper we love, the greater the potential for hatred. The more someone matters to us, the sharper the blade of betrayal when they falter. Strangers cannot wound us the way loved ones can. Indifference has no teeth. Intimacy cuts like a knife. And history, literature, and psychology alike revealed that between love and resentment, the boundary is not a wallet, is a fragile thread, one as easily snapped by disappointment, betrayal, or unmet expectation. Fyodor Dostoevsky, that master of the human soul, once observed that there is something at the bottom of every new human thought, every thought of genius, or even every earnest thought that springs up in any man's mind, which can be said to have been nurtured in the soil of love or in the soil of hatred. He knew what many are reluctant to face. Love and hate are not opposites, but siblings. They grow in the same soil, share the same roots, and when love is denied or betrayed, it does not disappear, it transforms. The lover does not become indifferent. They become a cynic, a skeptic, or a tormentor. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, went further, writing that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. To love, Freud argued, is to expose oneself naked to another's power. To love is to surrender sovereignty of the heart, to place our peace of mind into another's trembling hands. And when those hands drop it, whether carelessly or cruelly, we do not simply feel hurt, we feel rage disguised as grief. Freud called this ambivalence the unsettling truth that love always contains its opposite. To cling to someone with longing is to harbor, in the same breath, the potential to despise them. Nietzsche sharpened the blade further. In his dissection of morality and ressentiment, he showed how the powerless, unable to act upon their fury, transmuted into moral indignation, revenge through values. Nietzsche saw clearly that love, when shackled and disappointed, mutates into resentment, a poison that corrodes from within. He wrote of lovers whose passion collapses into contempt precisely because their devotion was so total. The intensity of their hope created the intensity of their rage. And so we return to the paradox of intimacy. The closer we allow someone to us, the more dangerous they become. Lovers, families, friends, these are the relationships in which the sharpest betrayals take place. For strangers cannot betray us. Only those we trusted can. The greater the intimacy, the greater the wound. And in the psyche of the empath, the one who feels too deeply, who carries not only their own wounds but the unspoken weight of others, this paradox becomes an unbearable prison. The empath is often depicted as a saint, a healer, a light in a darkened world. But in reality, they are far more fragile than we assume. Their strength lies in their capacity to feel, to absorb, to give endlessly without demanding. Yet therein lies their curse. For what happens when the love they pour forth is not reciprocated? What happens when their selfless devotion is taken for granted, or worse, exploited? The answer is rarely indifference. The empath, precisely because they invest so fully, because they fuse their identity with those they love, cannot simply let go. Their disappointment metastasizes. Their pain turns inward, breeding quiet resentment. And unlike others who may lash out in anger, the empath often suppresses this poison. They smile while bleeding. They continue giving while resenting. Their resentment festers in silence, disguised as loyalty. Consider the literature of broken intimacy. In Shakespeare's tragedies, love so often becomes the seed of destruction. Othello's love for Desdemona, twisted by jealousy, turns into murderous rage. In Wuthering Heights, Emily Brontë paints a portrait of love so consuming that when denied, it corrodes into bitterness, vengeance, and destruction across generations. The lesson echoes through time. Love that fails to find balance inevitably feeds resentment, even in sacred texts. The line between love and anger blurs. The God of the Hebrew Bible is described as both infinitely loving and infinitely wrathful. Love, when unmet or betrayed, seems almost destined to unleash fury. The intensity of affection contains within it the intensity of its own corruption. Yet resentment is not only an individual phenomenon, it is also collective. Nations that once adored their rulers can, upon betrayal, turn to revolution. Citizens once filled with patriotic love can, when their sacrifices are mocked or ignored, rise in resentment and fury. History is drenched in the blood of betrayed devotion. The French Revolution did not emerge from indifference. It emerged from a people who had loved their nation and felt abandoned. Revolutions are born not of apathy but of the deep wound of broken loyalty. And here lies the haunting truth for just as nations crumble when their devotion curdles, so too does the empath's spirit collapse when their love is not cherished. Because to the empath, love is not casual, it is not transactional, it is existential. When they love, they pour their essence into another, binding their sense of worth to how that love is received. Thus, when betrayal or neglect arrives, they feel not merely disappointment but annihilation. Their very identity fractures, and in the ruins grows resentment. But why do we cling so desperately to those who wound us? Why does love refuse to dissolve into indifference, choosing instead to fester as resentment? The answer lies in attachment. From infancy, we are wired to cling, to bond, to seek safety in the arms of another. To lose that bond is to awaken primal terror. Indifference would mean detachment, and detachment means death to the psyche that was shaped by the need for others. Thus, even when love is poisoned, we do not let go. Instead, we cling tighter, binding ourselves to the very source of pain. And so resentment becomes a perverse preservation of intimacy. It keeps the connection alive, even if only through bitterness. The empath knows this most of all. Their heightened sensitivity means they cannot detach. They continue to feel, to absorb, even when it harms them. They continue to love, even when that love has long since turned toxic. Their resentment is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, corrosive. Like acid in the veins, it eats away at their inner peace while leaving the mask of devotion intact. This paradox is not new. The ancients understood it. The Greeks told stories of gods and mortals whose loves turned to curses. The myth of Medea, who loved Jason so deeply that his betrayal drove her to vengeance unthinkable. The myth of Achilles, whose love for Patroclus transformed into a rage that burned down Troy. Again and again, myth and literature whisper the same warning. Love is a double-edged sword, and when it cuts most deeply into the hand that holds it. Yet what makes the empath unique is their inability to shield themselves. Others may armor their hearts, becoming cynical, detached, even cruel to avoid pain. But the empath cannot. To deny their capacity to feel would be to deny their very essence. And so they walk the knife's edge, suspended perpetually between devotion and disillusionment, between love and resentment. This fragility often leads empaths into cycles of toxic relationships. Drawn to those who need healing, they give endlessly, only to discover they are drained, unacknowledged, unappreciated. Their love becomes a quiet martyrdom, and when recognition never comes, their devotion curdles into bitterness. They resent not only the other but themselves for having given so much, for having ignored the warning signs, for having loved so recklessly. Their resentment becomes self-directed as much as outward, and herein lies the tragedy. The empath's curse is not merely that others betray them, but that they betray themselves. By refusing to set boundaries, by confusing sacrifice with love, they become complicit in their own resentment. They give until they are empty, then rage at the void within. Their resentment becomes a mirror, reflecting the truth they cannot face, that in seeking to save others, they have abandoned themselves. Philosophy and psychology converge on this uncomfortable truth. Love without boundaries is not love at all. It is possession. It is desperation. It is martyrdom disguised as devotion. And when such love inevitably collapses under its own weight, resentment is the only survivor. To recognize this fragility, the fragile line between love and resentment, is to step into the deeper journey we must now take. For the empath, understanding this paradox is not a matter of intellectual curiosity but of survival. To love deeply without being consumed, to give without cherish, to walk the tightrope without falling into resentment. This is the challenge that awaits. Empathy. It is a word we utter with reverence, almost as if it was synonymous with goodness itself. We call it the antidote to cruelty, the bridge that connects isolated souls, the balm for human suffering. In modern culture, empathy has been elevated to a near spiritual ideal, the quality that makes us humane, the compass that points toward moral truth. Yet, like all virtues that are worshipped too blindly, empathy carries a hidden shadow. What appears as a blessing, when taken to extremes, can reveal itself as a profound curse. The empath is the archetype of this paradox. They are celebrated as rare souls who feel deeply, who instinctively place themselves in the shoes of others, who are moved by suffering in ways most cannot comprehend. To be near an empath often feels like being seen, understood, and validated in a world that thrives on neglect. But behind this gift lies a burden that is invisible to most, a slow erosion of the self, a constant absorption of pain that can twist love into exhaustion, compassion into bitterness, and devotion into resentment. Empathy is not a modern discovery. Philosophers and poets have long wrestled with it. The Stoics, though cautious, understood its pull. Seneca warned that the mind that is stirred by the sorrows of another is burdened with another's misery. His caution was not born of cruelty but of wisdom. To feel too much of another's pain is to risk losing oneself entirely. Empathy without boundaries can transform a strong heart into a fragile vessel, cracked under the pressure of carrying more than it was built to hold. Psychology affirms what the ancients intuited. Neuroscience shows that empathy is not a soft metaphor but a biological reality. Mirror neurons fire in our brains when we witness another's joy or suffering, creating a direct echo of their emotions within us. It is why a baby cries when hearing another cry, why we wince when watching someone in pain. Empathy is not merely imagination, it is embodied resonance. But therein lies the danger. To live perpetually in resonance with others is to risk losing one's own frequency. Carl Jung, the great depth psychologist, offered a key to understanding this paradox. In his exploration of the psyche, Jung described projection, the unconscious tendency to see in others what we have disowned within ourselves. For empaths, projection becomes both gift and curse. They project their own depth of feeling onto others, assuming others feel as profoundly as they do. This makes them compassionate but also dangerously naive. They expect reciprocity where there is none. They give endlessly, projecting their own inner richness onto people who are incapable or unwilling to return it. When reality crashes down, the empath feels not only disappointment but devastation. Jung also spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the shadow, the unloved parts of ourselves. For the empath, individuation is particularly difficult. They are so outwardly focused, so consumed by the emotional landscapes of others, that they often neglect their own inner terrain. They become strangers to themselves, their identities blurred by the constant influx of others' needs. What begins as empathy becomes self-erasure. Modern psychology identifies this phenomenon as compassion fatigue. Doctors, nurses, therapists, those who live in constant proximity to the suffering of others often describe it hollowing out of their own emotional lives. They absorb too much pain until they are numb, resentful, or detached. The empath experiences a similar fate, but not through profession, through existence itself. Their nervous system becomes a battlefield, overwhelmed by waves of unfiltered emotion. And yet, society glorifies this. The empath is painted as a saint. Popular culture tells them their gift is what the world needs most. They are urged to love harder, give more, heal endlessly. But beneath the praise lies exploitation. A world that rewards empathy often does so because it benefits from empaths' sacrifice. Workplaces, relationships, and entire cultures feed on their willingness to carry what others will not. Their gift becomes their chains. Consider the metaphor of the sponge. A sponge absorbs indiscriminately clean water, dirty water, poison, filth. It does not choose. The empath too absorbs without filter. They take in joy, but also despair, cruelty, anger, and unlike the sponge, they cannot simply be wrung out at will. The absorbed emotions linger, weighing them down, changing their chemistry, altering their very perception of reality. They feel the world's pain as their own, and the longer they carry it, the more fragile they become. The irony is stark. What begins as a gift of connection slowly becomes a curse of disconnection. For as the empath absorbs more, they withdraw from their own needs. They silence their own desires to avoid conflict. They suppress their anger, fearing it would make them less loving. They hide their exhaustion, ashamed that their compassion has limits. Over time, they forget the sound of their own voice, the shape of their own soul. They become, in Jungian terms, possessed by an archetype, the martyr, the healer, until they are no longer individuals but symbols of sacrifice. The cost of this is resentment. But unlike overt resentment, which lashes out in anger, the empath's resentment simmers in silence. It shows itself in fatigue, in subtle withdrawal, in bitterness toward those they once cherished. It grows from unspoken words, unmet needs, and invisible boundaries crossed too many times. And because the empath fears confrontation, they bury this resentment deep, where it festers unseen. Literature has long captured this archetype. In Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the saintly Alyosha embodies boundless empathy, yet his innocence is shadowed by the corruption of those around him. His love cannot save them, it only exposes his vulnerability. In Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the character of Fantine sacrifices everything for her child, only to be abandoned, exploited, and destroyed by a society indifferent to her suffering. Her empathy becomes her undoing. These stories echo the warning. Empathy without strength leads not to salvation but to tragedy. But let us not forget, empathy is not inherently destructive. Its curse arises when it is unbalanced, unchecked, untempered by wisdom. True empathy requires not only the ability to feel another's pain but also the ability to return to oneself, to discern what is and is not ours to carry. Without this discernment, empathy is indistinguishable from emotional servitude. This is why some philosophers, like Arthur Schopenhauer, were suspicious of empathy as a moral foundation. Schopenhauer argued that compassion could motivate altruism, but he also warned that it was unreliable, prone to exhaustion and distortion. He believed that true ethics must come not from endless identification with others' suffering but from principles rooted in clarity and self. To rely on empathy alone is to build a house on quicksand. And yet, in our age of loneliness and disconnection, empaths are more necessary than ever. They remind us of what it means to be human in a world increasingly dominated by screens, algorithms, and cold utilitarian logic. But for empaths to survive their own gift, they must recognize its double-edged nature. They must see that the same sensitivity that allows them to connect can also destroy them if left unguarded. Here we touch the heart of the paradox. Empathy is both salvation and damnation, both bridge and burden. The empath must learn what few are willing to admit, that love without boundaries breeds resentment, and compassion without self-care breeds collapse. The gift of empathy is real, but so is its curse. To deny either side is to live in illusion. The journey forward then is not to abandon empathy, but to master it, to wield it consciously, not as an unconscious reflex. To give, but not to bleed dry. To feel, but not to drown. To carry others, but never at the expense of abandoning oneself. This requires courage of a different kind, not the courage to absorb endlessly, but the courage to say no, the courage to draw lines, the courage to let others bear the weight of their own choices. For the empath, this courage feels unnatural, even cruel, but in truth, it is the only path to freedom. Without it, their gift will always remain a curse. With it, empathy becomes what it was meant to be, a channel for connection, not a tool of self-destruction, and so we end with a haunting realization. The empath's challenge is not simply to feel, but to survive feeling. Not simply to connect, but to remain whole while connected. To embrace the paradox of their gift and their curse, and in doing so, to begin the long, the difficult path of individuation where love is no longer martyrdom, but a balanced force, capable of healing without destroying the healer. Resentment. It is a word that carries the weight of centuries of human frustration, a word whispered through clenched teeth, carved into revolutions, hidden beneath polite smiles. It is a silent poison, one that does not kill quickly but corrodes slowly, steadily, invisibly. We tend to imagine resentment as a fleeting irritation or a grudge that time will wash away. But the truth is far darker. Resentment is one of the most enduring and destructive forces in the human soul, where anger is fire-sucked, explosive, cathartic resentment is ice. It freezes the heart, preserves the wound, keeps it alive long after it should have faded. Anger exhausts itself, but resentment endures, looping endlessly in the mind, replaying the offense until it is no longer just an event but an identity. Those who carry resentment are never free of their offenders. They are chained to them, reliving betrayal in perpetuity. To understand resentment, we must begin with Nietzsche. Few thinkers dissected this phenomenon as surgically as he did. In his Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche introduced the concept of ressentiment, not mere resentment, but a deep psychological inversion that occurs when the powerless cannot act on their rage. Instead of direct revenge, they transmute their anger into moral superiority. Unable to strike their enemies, they redefine weakness as virtue, strength as vice. In this way, ressentiment becomes creative, giving birth to entire moral systems, ideologies that masks envy and bitterness as righteousness. For Nietzsche, Christianity was the grand edifice of resentment. The meek, unable to conquer the strong, declared meekness holy. The oppressed, unable to overthrow their masters, declared suffering divine. What began as impotence became moral revolution. This is the anatomy of resentment at its most profound. When pain cannot be released outward, it mutates inward, reshaping the very values by which people live. But resentment is not confined to religion. It festers in families, friendships, marriages, and societies. It thrives wherever power is unequal, wherever voices are silenced, wherever anger is repressed. Freud noted that suppressed hostility never disappears. It seeps into the unconscious, warping dreams, sabotaging relationships, fueling neuroses. Resentment, for Freud, was the symptom of unexpressed conflict, a wound kept open precisely because it could never bleed. Consider the domestic sphere. A partner who sacrifices endlessly, swallowing small indignities in the name of peace, may appear devoted on the surface, but beneath lies quiet resentment. Each unspoken frustration compounding until love is no longer love but obligation wrapped in bitterness. The empath especially is vulnerable to this fate. Their instinct to absorb, to forgive, to avoid confrontation, plants the perfect soil for resentment. They do not explode in anger, they endure, and endurance, over time, hardens into quiet hatred masked as loyalty. History too is littered with resentment's fingerprints. Revolutions rarely erupt from sudden anger. They grow from decades of simmering resentment, from people who tolerated exploitation too long, who endured indignity until the weight became unbearable. The French Revolution was born of peasants' resentment toward a decadent aristocracy. The Russian Revolution, of workers' resentment toward a ruling class insulated from hunger. Resentment is not an outburst, it is a slow, inevitable detonation. At the personal level, resentment often disguises itself as morality. The person who feels unseen convinces themselves they are simply more giving than others. The one who feels exploited convinces themselves they are more virtuous. Resentment thrives on comparison, on stories we tell ourselves about fairness, justice, and what is owed. And yet, these stories rarely bring peace. They trap us in loops of bitterness. The anatomy of resentment can be broken into 3 stages. First is the wound, the betrayal, the neglect, the broken promise. This is the seed. Second is suppression. Instead of expressing pain, we bury it, often because we fear conflict, fear abandonment, or lack the power to resist. Third is rumination, the endless replaying of the wound, each replay deepening the scar. This cycle transforms a single injury into a permanent lens through which all of life is interpreted. For the empath, this cycle is magnified. Their wound is deeper because they feel more. Their suppression is stronger because they fear confrontation. Their rumination is longer because they cannot detach. Thus, what might be a passing frustration for others becomes an identity-shaping poison for them. They become the one who was wronged, carrying the offense as proof of their sacrifice, as justification for their quiet bitterness. Yet resentment is seductive. It offers a kind of twisted comfort. To resent is to hold on. It keeps us connected to the person who hurt us, even if through hatred rather than love. It preserves a sense of moral superiority. I was wronged, therefore I am better. It gives us identity where once we had intimacy, but the cost is immense. For while resentment binds us to others, it also shackles us. The offender continues to live rent-free in the mind of the offended, their presence lingering long after the relationship has ended. This is why resentment is often described as drinking poison and expecting the other to die, but this cliché misses the deeper truth. Resentment is not just self-harm, it is self-definition. It shapes who we are, how we think, how we relate to the world. A person consumed by resentment does not simply suffer, they become their suffering. Literature again provides haunting mirrors. In the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes is consumed by resentment after betrayal, and though his revenge is grand, his soul is scarred. In Great Expectations, Miss Havisham wastes away in her decaying wedding dress, frozen in resentment against the lover who abandoned her. Her bitterness poisoning not only herself but everyone around her. These are not mere stories, they are archetypes of what happens when resentment is allowed to crystallize into identity. But if resentment is so destructive, why do we cling to it? Because it offers what love cannot control. Love makes us vulnerable. Resentment makes us righteous. Love opens us. Resentment shields us. Love can be betrayed. Resentment cannot. To let go of resentment is to accept our powerlessness, to acknowledge the wound without guarantee of justice. And for many, this is unbearable. Better to cling to bitterness than to admit helplessness. The empath faces this temptation acutely. Having given everything, they feel they cannot simply walk away. To let go of resentment would mean admitting their sacrifice was wasted, their devotion ignored, their love unrespected. Resentment becomes their last possession, the one thing no one can take from them. But in protecting themselves with bitterness, they lose the very essence of love they once cherished. Modern culture thrives on this. Social media, politics, and ideology often weaponize resentment. Outrage is currency, grievance a badge of honor. Entire movements define themselves not by what they love, but by what they resent. And in a world that rewards victimhood, empaths find themselves drowning, unable to distinguish their own pain from the collective bitterness surrounding them. Philosophically, resentment reveals a deep truth about the human condition, that we are creatures of memory. Animals may feel anger in the moment, but they do not carry grudges for decades. Humans do. Our memory is both our greatest gift and our greatest curse. It allows us to build civilizations, to learn from the past, but it also traps us in endless loops of reliving our wounds. Resentment is memory weaponized against the self. The anatomy of resentment, then, is not only psychological but existential. It is the refusal to release, the insistence on holding on to pain as if it were treasure. It is the transformation of love into bitterness, of intimacy into distance, of wounds into monuments. And for the empath, who feels more, remembers more, and absorbs more, resentment becomes almost inevitable unless they learn the art of boundaries in the end. Resentment is not simply a flaw of character but a distortion of love. It is love turned sour, devotion curdled, intimacy poisoned. To understand resentment is to see that it is never far from love. It is love's shadow, following it wherever it goes. And unless we confront this shadow, unless we acknowledge its presence within us, love itself remains forever at risk of collapse. Love, in its purest form, is imagined as a union of equals, a merging of two souls who meet one another with freedom, respect, and reciprocity. But the reality of human relationships rarely aligns with this romantic vision, for love is not merely affection, it is also need, and wherever there is need, there is dependency. Wherever there is dependency, there is power, and wherever there is power, there lurks the potential for control. We prefer to think of love as liberation, as a force that elevates us beyond the prisons of isolation. But history, literature, and psychology remind us that love is also a binding, a contract, a delicate dance between intimacy and captivity. What begins as devotion can become domination. What begins as sacrifice can become servitude. What begins as tenderness can become tyranny. The shadow of love is not hatred alone, it is dependency warped into control. In the psychology of attachment, this paradox is evident from the very beginning of life. The infant, utterly dependent on the caregiver, learns that survival itself is tethered to the presence, affection, and responsiveness of another. Love and need are fused into a single experience. If the caregiver is attuned, love feels secure. If the caregiver is absent, inconsistent, or manipulative, love becomes anxiety, desperation, or submission. These early imprints often become the templates for adult intimacy. We learn unconsciously that to be loved is to depend, and to depend is to risk control. The empath in particular is vulnerable to this dynamic. Their heightened sensitivity and natural orientation toward others make them prone to self-abandonment. They mistake dependency for devotion, sacrifice for loyalty. They believe that to love is to give endlessly, even if it means losing themselves. And in doing so, they open the door to relationships where power is uneven, where control replaces reciprocity, where love becomes shadowed by resentment. History is replete with examples of dependency turning into control. Monarchs demanded the adoration of their subjects, framing loyalty as love. Cult leaders thrived on the dependency of their followers, disguising domination as spiritual devotion. Even within families, parents sometimes wield their children's dependence as leverage, dictating not only behavior but identity itself. Love, in these contexts, is weaponized. It becomes a justification for control. "I do this because I love you" becomes the mask behind which power hides its teeth. Philosophy too has grappled with this paradox. Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist, warned that love can become despair when it demands possession. To truly love, he argued, is to will the freedom of the other. But most of us, whether we admit it or not, fear freedom in those we love. We cling, we demand, we seek to bind the other to us because their departure would expose our dependency, our vulnerability, our emptiness. Thus, in the name of love, we often attempt to control. The empath finds themselves caught in this trap more often than most. Because they give so much, they often believe they have earned security. Yet, when their sacrifices are not reciprocated, they feel betrayed, not realizing that their dependency disguised itself as unconditional love. They resent the other for taking advantage, but they also resent themselves for having given so recklessly. What began as devotion turns into quiet accusations. "After everything I've done for you, how could you treat me this way?" This is the hidden script of dependency, the expectation of control through sacrifice. Literature again offers mirrors. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, a woman confined by her husband under the guise of love deteriorates into madness. His control, justified as care, erases her identity. In Ibsen's A Doll's House, Nora realizes that her husband's love is a cage, a form of ownership dressed as affection. These stories remind us that love, when entwined with dependency, easily becomes domination. But control is not always overt. Sometimes it manifests in subtle manipulations, the withholding of affection to enforce compliance, the guilt-tripping disguised as devotion, the silent expectation that one partner will always give more than the other. Dependency creates the conditions for these dynamics. The one who needs more is always at risk of being controlled. And the empath, who often gives more, finds themselves trapped in invisible contracts they never agreed to but silently enforce through their own sacrifice. Power dynamics in love are not limited to individuals, they echo in society at large. Nations often frame patriotism as love, demanding sacrifice from citizens while exploiting their dependency. Employers speak of family while using loyalty to extract more labor. Ideologies speak of compassion while demanding conformity. Everywhere, love becomes entangled with power, and dependency becomes a tool of control. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this entanglement arises because love awakens our earliest vulnerabilities. To love is to re-experience the helplessness of infancy, the desperate need for the other to stay, to care, to not abandon us. And when that need is not balanced with boundaries, it becomes a leash held by whoever offers or withholds affection. Love's shadow is not simply hatred but the loss of autonomy under the weight of dependency. The empath's tragedy is that they often mistake this loss of autonomy for proof of love. They believe that to dissolve into the other is noble, that to erase themselves is selfless, that to endure control is loyalty. They cannot see that in giving away their freedom, they are planting the seeds of future resentment. For no soul can endure servitude forever, not even under the banner of love. And so, dependency breeds power, power invites control, and control breeds resentment. The cycle is as old as humanity itself. A child resents the parent who controls them in the name of love. A partner resents the spouse who dominates them under the guise of devotion. Citizens resent rulers who demand loyalty but return only exploitation. Empaths resent those who take endlessly while giving nothing in return. But beneath resentment lies a deeper truth. Dependency is not love. Love that cannot survive without control is not love, it is fear. Love that demands the other erase themselves is not love, it is possession. Love that thrives only on sacrifice is not love, it is bondage. To see this truth requires courage, for it strips away the illusions we cling to. It forces us to admit that much of what we call love is, in fact, shadow dependency, power, control, and the resentments they breed. And for the empath who has lived their life in the service of others, this realization is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it reveals how much of their love has been entangled in unhealthy bonds. Liberating because it offers the first step toward authentic love that does not enslave but frees. Love that does not control but respects. Love that does not demand resentment as its inevitable price. In the end, the anatomy of love's shadow reveals a sobering paradox. To love without boundaries is to invite control. To depend without discernment is to invite resentment. And until we confront this shadow, love will always risk collapsing into its own opposite. For where there is dependency, there will be power. Where there is power, there will be control. And where there is control, there will be the slow, corrosive birth of resentment. There is a peculiar tragedy in the life of the empath. They are both the healer and the wound, the rescuer and the captive. They give endlessly, convinced that their worth is measured by the depth of their sacrifice. And in this endless giving, they betray themselves. The empath does not wake up one morning deciding to surrender their identity. It happens gradually, like a slow erosion of stone beneath water. Piece by piece, moment by moment, they chip away at themselves until there is little left but the shadow of who they once were. To understand this descent, we must first see the empath as a creature shaped by early lessons. Perhaps they learned, in childhood, that love is conditional, that affection is granted only when they are pleasing, helpful, quiet, or selfless. Perhaps they absorbed the pain of a parent and tried to soothe it, believing their own happiness could wait. Perhaps they were praised not for their individuality, but for their ability to adapt, to accommodate, to put others first. These early imprints become their compass, leading them into adulthood with a single directive. Love is earned through self-betrayal. At first, this betrayal does not look like betrayal at all. It looks like devotion. It looks like kindness. It looks like compassion. The empath gives their time, their energy, their soul. They listen without judgment. They carry burdens that are not theirs. They stay up at night soothing others' storms while silencing their own. To the outside world, they appear noble, almost saintly, but inside, something begins to fracture. Every time they say yes when they want to say no. Every time they remain silent when they long to speak. Every time they swallow their truth to preserve another's comfort, they carve a wound into their own being. This wound is subtle at first. It appears as fatigue, as a quiet sense of emptiness, as a longing they cannot quite name. But over time it grows into something darker: resentment, despair, even self-contempt. For the empath begins to realize that while they give endlessly, the world rarely gives back. They begin to see that those they protect often feel entitled to their protection, that those they nurture often take without gratitude, that those they love sometimes mistake their selflessness for weakness, and the empath, though they will not say it aloud, begins to hate themselves for allowing it. This is the essence of self-betrayal. The empath sacrifices their authenticity for the illusion of love, their boundaries for the illusion of safety, their dignity for the illusion of worth. In doing so, they abandon themselves. Psychology offers language for this process. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to adapt to the world. For the empath, the persona is the helper, the healer, the one who exists for others. But beneath this mask lies the shadow, all the repressed anger, needs, and desires they deny. The more the empath identifies with their persona, the more violently their shadow grows. And eventually, the shadow demands recognition, often in destructive ways. It might appear as sudden outbursts of anger, as a quiet withdrawal from life, as illness, or even as depression. The empath who has betrayed themselves cannot escape the consequences forever. The psyche rebels against its own erasure. Philosophy too has warned of this danger. Nietzsche, in his critique of morality, warned against the self-sacrificing ethic that glorifies weakness disguised as virtue. He saw in it a hidden resentment, a kind of poison that corrodes the soul. The empath, in living as the perpetual martyr, embodies this danger. They believe they are virtuous, but beneath their virtue festers resentment, not only toward others, but toward themselves. Their love, over time, becomes hollow, their compassion tinged with bitterness, their selflessness a mask for suppressed rage. Literature offers countless portrayals of this descent. Think of Chekhov's characters, who endure lives of quiet desperation, giving and giving until they wither away. Think of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, whose passion and self-abandonment lead her to ruin. Think of Shakespeare's Ophelia, who drowns not only in water but in the weight of a world that demanded her silence and sacrifice. These stories endure because they echo the empath's tragedy, the betrayal of the self in pursuit of love that never comes. And yet the empath clings to the illusion. Why? Because the alternative, facing the emptiness within, admitting the anger they feel, reclaiming their right to exist as individuals, feels terrifying. To betray others would be unthinkable, so they choose, instead, to betray themselves. But self-betrayal does not go unnoticed. The body keeps score. The empath may begin to suffer from exhaustion, chronic illness, or unexplained pain. Their mind rebels, slipping into depression, anxiety, or numbness. Their spirit feels crushed, as if life itself has lost meaning. What they cannot express outwardly, they turn inward, punishing themselves for the sins of others. And so, the empath becomes their own oppressor. This descent has societal echoes as well. Entire cultures encourage self-betrayal in the name of conformity. Workers sacrifice their individuality for corporations. Citizens sacrifice truth for loyalty to the state. Women throughout history have been told their worth lies in serving others, erasing themselves in the process. The empath's personal tragedy is, in truth, a universal pattern. Humanity's tendency to sacrifice authenticity for belonging, freedom for acceptance, truth for comfort, but there is a limit to how long the soul can endure self-betrayal. At some point, the empath awakens, whether through a crisis, a betrayal, or sheer exhaustion. They realize that no one will rescue them, that no amount of giving will fill the void, that no external love can replace the love they have denied themselves. And in this moment, they face a choice: continue the descent into bitterness and self-erasure, or begin the difficult ascent toward selfhood. The danger of the first path is obvious. The empath becomes hollow, resentful, even cruel in their quiet way. Their love turns toxic. Their compassion turns manipulative. Their resentment festers into passive aggression. They become a shadow of themselves, a martyr who secretly despises the very people they claim to serve. The promise of the second path is harder, but real: to stop betraying themselves, to set boundaries, to reclaim their voice, to learn that love does not require. This requires courage, for it means disappointing others, breaking patterns, facing loneliness. It means learning to sit with guilt without letting it dictate choices. It means learning that saying no is not cruelty but self-preservation. For the empath, this awakening is not the end of love but its beginning. Only when they cease betraying themselves can they love authentically, without resentment, without hidden expectations, without fear. They begin to see that true compassion is not self-destruction but self-expression, not martyrdom but authenticity. The descent into self-betrayal is the empath's greatest danger, but also their greatest teacher. For in reaching the bottom of that descent, they are confronted with the most haunting truth of all: that they were never unloved by others, they were unloved by themselves. And the moment they choose to love themselves, to honor their own boundaries, to protect their own soul, the descent ends. It is only then that they can rise, not as martyrs, but as whole beings who finally understand that love without selfhood is not love at all. Resentment is often spoken of as a poison, and in many ways it is. It corrodes intimacy, it eats at the soul, it distorts love into bitterness and compassion into contempt. Yet there is another truth, one that philosophy and psychology whisper but rarely proclaim aloud. Resentment, if faced honestly, can also become a crucible. Like fire consuming metal, it burns away illusions, forcing transformation. It is the alchemy of pain, the process by which suffering, if not denied, can forge strength, clarity, and authenticity. To begin, we must understand what resentment truly is. Nietzsche described it with the French word ressentiment: a festering hostility born of suppressed power, of desires denied expression. It is not the clean anger that erupts and fades. It is the lingering anger that hides, simmering in silence, replaying wounds like a broken record. Resentment is the story we tell ourselves about how others have wronged us, and the silent accusation we turn inward when we realize we allowed it. For the empath, resentment is inevitable because they give endlessly without boundaries. Their sacrifices go unnoticed, their loyalty exploited, their compassion mistaken for weakness. And when the truth becomes unbearable, they retreat into silence. But silence is not forgiveness, it is the breeding ground of resentment. Resentment, however, is not only destruction, it is a mirror. It shows us where we have betrayed ourselves, where we have tolerated the intolerable, where we have confused servitude with love. It points, with ruthless accuracy, to the places where our boundaries were violated or abandoned. To the empath, this realization feels devastating, like the collapse of the world they carefully constructed. But within this devastation lies the seed of transformation. For resentment is not only the end of illusion, it is the beginning of truth. History reveals how resentment has often been the spark of change. Entire revolutions were born from collective resentment. The French Revolution erupted from the resentment of the starving masses toward the decadence of the elite. The American Civil Rights Movement arose from generations of resentment against injustice and oppression. The women's suffrage movement was fueled by the resentment of silence, the quiet rage of being told their voices did not matter. Resentment, when acknowledged and directed, becomes not poison but power. It transforms the powerless into agents of change. The same dynamic unfolds within the individual. The empath, once they acknowledge their resentment, begins to see their life with brutal clarity. They recognize the one-sided relationships that drained them, the sacrifices that went unappreciated, the countless moments they silenced themselves for others. This recognition hurts. It feels like betrayal layered upon betrayal. But it also awakens them. They realize that their resentment is not proof of weakness, but proof that something within them still refuses to die. It is the soul's rebellion against erasure. Philosophy affirms this. Kierkegaard argued that despair, though painful, is the starting point of selfhood. To despair is to confront the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Resentment is a form of despair, but it carries within it a hidden gift, the demand for authenticity. In resenting others for exploiting us, we begin to resent ourselves for allowing it. This is painful, but it is also liberating, because once we admit our complicity, we reclaim our power to change. Literature reflects this alchemy vividly. Think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where the creature's resentment toward his creator drives him to vengeance, but also gives him voice, identity, and agency. or Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, where the narrator's festering resentment exposes the sickness of a society obsessed with rationality at the cost of humanity. These characters are not admirable, but they are transformed by their pain. Resentment grants them vision, however twisted. It tears away naivety and replaces it with raw, unflinching awareness. For the empath, the danger is not resentment itself, but denial of it. Denied resentment mutates into self-destruction, depression, numbness, chronic illness, quiet bitterness that rots the spirit. But acknowledged resentment, spoken, confronted, examined, can become the foundation of boundaries. It can become the voice that finally says, enough. Psychology teaches that healing begins not with suppressing feelings, but with facing them. Resentment, when understood, reveals unmet needs. It reveals where we gave too much, where we silenced ourselves, where we allowed control. The empath who dares to face their resentment discovers not only their wounds, but their worth. They see that their anger is not a flaw, but a signal that their soul is demanding. Recognition. The alchemy of resentment, then, is the process of transmuting poison into medicine. This transformation does not happen overnight. It begins with honesty, the willingness to admit resentment without shame. It deepens with reflection, asking what this resentment reveals about our choices, our patterns, our wounds. And it culminates in action, the courage to set boundaries, to speak truth, to reclaim self-hood. Society, of course, fears resentment. It prefers forgiveness without confrontation, harmony without truth. But harmony built on suppression is fragile. True peace arises only when resentment has been burned into clarity. The empath who learns this becomes dangerous, not in the sense of cruelty, but in the sense of sovereignty. They are no longer easy to control, no longer willing to sacrifice themselves blindly, no longer seduced by illusions of love that demand their erasure. Their resentment has given them a backbone. This is the paradox. The very emotion we fear as corrosive is often the catalyst of growth. Just as fire destroys but also purifies, resentment can burn away the false and leave behind the real. The empath, in embracing this alchemy, discovers a strange liberation. Their love, once entangled with dependency and control, becomes sharper, clearer. They learn to love without losing themselves, to give without betraying themselves, to forgive without forgetting the lessons of pain. In the end, resentment is not the enemy of love, but its shadow, a shadow that, when faced, teaches us the contours of light. It reminds us that to love authentically, we must also honor ourselves. That to give without resentment, we must give from fullness, not emptiness. That to be empaths who heal, we must first heal the wound of self-betrayal. Thus, the alchemy of resentment is not the end of love, it is its rebirth. For only through the fire of pain does the empath learn the most important truth of all, that love is not the abandonment of self, but the deepest expression of it. To live as an empath in the modern world is to walk through a labyrinth designed to exploit sensitivity. Never before in history has human psychology been so thoroughly studied, dissected, and weaponized. Corporations, governments, media, conglomerates will have learned how to manipulate attention, shape desire, and engineer consent. The empath, whose nature is to feel deeply and to absorb the emotions of others, is uniquely vulnerable in this landscape, for the very qualities that make them compassionate also make them targets. In the past, manipulation was crude. Kings demanded loyalty, priests threatened damnation, tyrants ruled through brute fear. But in the modern age, manipulation is subtle, sophisticated, and nearly invisible. It arrives in the form of advertisements crafted not merely to sell products, but to sell identities. It arrives in political rhetoric engineered to evoke fear and belonging. It arrives in the endless scroll of social media feeds, designed to hijack the nervous system and trap the mind in cycles of comparison, outrage, and desire. For the empath, this environment is suffocating. Their porous boundaries mean they absorb not only the emotions of those closest to them, but also the manufactured emotions of entire systems. They feel the panic of the news cycle, the grief of global tragedies, the outrage of online communities, the loneliness embedded in curated perfection. What once might have been contained to the family, the village, the immediate circle of life is now magnified to a global scale. The empath becomes not merely a healer of individuals, but an unwitting carrier of the world's pain. This has consequences. The empath's compassion, stretched across 1,000 crises, risks collapsing into numbness. Their sense of responsibility becomes unbearable. They feel guilty for not doing enough, guilty for resting, guilty for existing in a world where suffering is endless. Manipulation thrives on this guilt, for a guilty empath is an obedient empath eager to donate, eager to conform, eager to silence their own needs in service of causes they scarcely understand. History provides warnings. Propaganda has always exploited empathy. In wartime, nations appeal to compassion for the innocent to justify atrocities. During revolutions, leaders inflame outrage to rally the masses, only to replace one form of control with another. In the 20th century, psychologists like Edward Bernays, nephew of Freud, pioneered techniques of persuasion that would shape modern advertising and politics by appealing to unconscious desires, fears, and empathy itself. He proved that the masses could be guided without realizing they were being led. The empath whose defenses are thin becomes the most susceptible to this invisible hand. Philosophy to foresaw this danger. Guy Debord, in The Society of the Spectacle, argued that modern life is no longer lived directly but through representations, images, symbols, narratives crafted to mediate reality. We do not encounter the world as it is. We encounter the spectacle of it. For the empath, this is perilous. Their emotions respond to images and stories as if they were reality, binding them to illusions. A child suffering on a screen feels as immediate as a child before their eyes. A stranger's outrage online feels as invasive as the anger of a loved one. The empath becomes trapped in the spectacle, bleeding endlessly for a world that profits from their sensitivity. Yet the most insidious manipulation is not external, it is internalized. The modern empath is taught to measure their worth through productivity, their goodness through service, their love through self. Social systems reward those who give without question, who silence dissent, who conform to the greater good, and so the empath begins to betray themselves, not merely in personal relationships, but in their relationship with society itself. They trade authenticity for acceptance, individuality for conformity, compassion for obedience. This is not accidental. Systems of power thrive on empaths who never rebel. The selfless worker who sacrifices health for the company, the loyal citizen who accepts surveillance for the promise of safety, the dutiful caregiver who carries generations of burden without protests. These are the archetypes that sustain hierarchies. The empath, celebrated for their kindness, is rewarded only so long as they remain compliant. The moment they question, the moment they set boundaries, the mask of approval drops. And so, the empath faces a haunting dilemma in the modern age: remain open and risk manipulation, or close themselves and risk losing their essence. This tension is not easily resolved. Some retreat into cynicism, numbing their empathy to survive. Others drown in the flood of emotions, consumed by despair. Few find the narrow path between the path of conscious empathy, where compassion is guided by discernment and boundaries. Literature again offers metaphors for this condition. Orwell's 1984 depicted a world where even emotions were monitored, love itself harnessed by the state. Huxley's Brave New World imagined a society anesthetized by pleasure where empathy was drowned in distraction. In both visions, manipulation of feeling was central to control. Today, reality echoes fiction. The empath's heart, once their strength, becomes the battlefield upon which systems of power wage their quiet wars. But there is hope in awareness. To name manipulation is to weaken its hold. The empath who learns to distinguish authentic feeling from manufactured sentiment begins to reclaim sovereignty. They recognize when guilt is weaponized, when compassion is exploited, when outrage is engineered. They begin to see that not every cry for their attention is genuine, that not every demand for their sacrifice is just. They learn that empathy without discernment is not virtue but vulnerability. Psychology supports this path. Research into emotional intelligence emphasizes the importance of regulation, discernment, and boundaries. To feel deeply is a gift, but only when paired with the capacity to choose where to invest that feeling. The empath's task in the modern world is not to feel less, but to feel wisely, to distinguish between the authentic suffering that calls for action and the manipulative narratives that drain without purpose. This transformation is not easy. It requires the empath to face uncomfortable truths: that not all causes are noble, that not all victims are innocent, that not all suffering can be healed. It requires them to resist the addictive pull of outrage, the seductive glow of moral superiority, the endless guilt of never doing enough. It requires them to accept their limits, to know that their compassion, though vast, is not infinite. Yet in this acceptance lies freedom. For once the empath realizes they are not obligated to absorb the world's pain, they begin to reclaim their own life. They rediscover joy, creativity, individuality. They begin to love without resentment, to give without erasure, to serve without submission. They learn that empathy, when guarded by wisdom, becomes not a liability but a form of quiet power. The power to remain human in a world that seeks to dehumanize. The modern condition is indeed perilous for the empath. Manipulation surrounds them, subtle and relentless. But it is also an invitation, for never before has the need for conscious, discerning empathy been greater. In a world drowning in spectacle, noise, and division, the empath who refuses to be manipulated becomes a rare force, a reminder that true compassion cannot be bought, engineered, or controlled. In the end, the empath's task is not to shut down, nor to give endlessly, but to walk the narrow path between, to feel without drowning, to care without betraying themselves, to resist manipulation by anchoring themselves in truth. And in doing so, they transform from prey into guardians not only of their own soul, but of the fragile humanity still struggling to breathe in an age of control. To break the cycle of love turning into resentment, the empath must confront a truth that often terrifies them more than betrayal itself: that they are complicit in their own suffering. This is not to blame, but to awaken. For cycles do not repeat merely because others inflict harm. They repeat because something within the empath allows, forgives, and endures until the pattern becomes destiny. Self-redemption begins the moment the empath realizes that their greatest act of compassion must be directed inward. But how does one redeem themselves when their very nature is to give away everything they are? The answer is neither simple nor sentimental. It requires dismantling illusions, facing uncomfortable truths, and embracing a kind of inner revolution. Like the phoenix, redemption demands fire, the burning of false identities, distorted beliefs, and emotional debts carried for too long. The first step is recognition. Most empaths enter relationships, whether romantic, familial, or societal, with the unspoken belief that love is earned through sacrifice. They learned this in childhood, where affection was conditional upon compliance, silence, or caretaking. They internalized the lesson: I must suffer to be loved. As adults, this belief mutates into patterns where they overextend, overgive, and overlook. The inevitable result is resentment, for no amount of giving ever fills the void. To recognize this conditioning is to pierce the veil. It is to finally ask, what if love is not meant to cost me myself? The second step is reclamation. The empath must reclaim what they have abandoned: their boundaries, their voice, their needs, their right to exist without justification. This reclamation is often the most painful, for it feels like betrayal. The empath has been conditioned to equate boundaries with selfishness, voice with conflict, need with weakness. To reclaim them feels like becoming the very thing they fear: cold, distant, unkind. Yet this is illusion. Boundaries do not kill love, they protect it. Voice does not destroy harmony, it clarifies it. Need does not signify weakness, it signifies humanity. Without reclamation, the empath will forever serve as a vessel emptied by others. The third step is redefinition. The empath must redefine what love means. Too often, love has been confused with self-erasure, with endurance of pain, with unconditional forgiveness of betrayal. This is not love, it is bondage. True love is not measured by how much suffering one tolerates, but by how much truth one shares. It is not sustained by silence, but by honesty. To redefine love is to break the chains of inherited scripts, the idea that loyalty must be blind, that compassion must be endless, that forgiveness must come without accountability. Redefinition means declaring, I will love, but not at the cost of myself. Philosophy offers guidance here. Nietzsche warned against what he called slave morality, a morality of submission, where virtues are defined by endurance, meekness, and self. For the empath, breaking the cycle means refusing this morality. It means embracing what Nietzsche would call the will to power, not domination over others, but sovereignty over oneself. It means becoming the author of one's own values, rather than inheriting the values of those who exploited their kindness. Psychology deepens this path. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, the hidden parts of the self that are repressed. For the empath, the shadow often contains anger, assertiveness, and desire, all disowned in the pursuit of harmony. To redeem themselves, empaths must integrate these shadows, allowing themselves to feel anger without shame, to assert without guilt, to desire without apology. Without this integration, resentment festers. With it, wholeness emerges. Yet, redemption is not purely individual. The empath lives in a web of relationships, and breaking the cycle inevitably disrupts them. When the empath begins to change, others resist. The partner who thrived on their compliance accuses them of selfishness. The family that relied on their silence brands them ungrateful. The workplace that exploited their dedication calls them disloyal. Redemption, therefore, requires courage to withstand backlash. The courage to lose what was never truly love. The courage to endure solitude as the price of freedom. This solitude is not a void, but a crucible. In the silence left by broken patterns, the empath begins to hear themselves again. They rediscover passions buried beneath obligation, creativity suffocated by responsibility, joy drowned by guilt. They begin to ask, not, who must I save, but who am I when I am not saving? This is the heart of self-redemption, the rediscovery of self beyond the roles imposed by others. But redemption is not only survival, it is transformation. To break the cycle is not merely to protect oneself, but to emerge wiser, stronger, more discerning. The redeemed empath does not abandon love, they refine it. Their empathy, once indiscriminate, becomes intentional. They no longer bleed for every wound, but choose where to invest their care. They no longer forgive without thought, but hold others accountable. They no longer confuse sacrifice with love, but see love as the space where both partners can flourish without erasure. Literature and myth echo this path. In Greek mythology, Orpheus descended into the underworld to retrieve Eurydice, only to lose her by looking back. The empath too descends into the underworld of resentment, seeking to reclaim themselves. But unlike Orpheus, they must resist the temptation to look back, to long for the old patterns, the old illusions. Redemption requires forward movement, a refusal to return to the chains that once defined them. History also provides examples of this cycle broken. Think of individuals who defied manipulation, who refused to be consumed by systems designed to exploit them, whistleblowers who risked everything to reveal truth, artists who refused to silence their vision for the sake of conformity, philosophers who questioned dogma even at the cost of exile. Each, in their own way, chose self-sovereignty over submission. The empath's redemption, though quieter, is part of the same lineage, the choice to live in truth rather than in bondage. There is, however, a danger in this transformation, the risk of becoming hardened, of mistaking boundaries for walls, discernment for cynicism, strength for coldness. Redemption is not about abandoning empathy but purifying it. The empath must remain open to love, but not to abuse. They must remain compassionate, but not compliant. They must remain sensitive, but not manipulated. This balance is fragile, requiring constant vigilance, but it is the only way to break the cycle without becoming the very thing they despised. And so, the path of self-redemption is a paradox. It asks the empath to turn inward in order to turn outward more authentically. It asks them to reclaim what was lost in order to give more wisely. It asks them to accept their limits in order to discover their strength. It is not a path of comfort, but of liberation. In the end, breaking the cycle is less about changing others than about changing the self. It is about refusing to be defined by betrayal, refusing to let resentment calcify into identity. It is about becoming whole, even when others prefer you broken. It is about learning that the greatest act of love an empath can perform is not martyrdom but authenticity. For only the authentic self can love without resentment, give without depletion, and stand without collapsing. Self-redemption, then, is not a destination but a continual choice. Each day the empath must choose to speak when silence tempts, to rest when guilt whispers, to walk away when fear binds. Each day they must resist the gravitational pull of old patterns, the seductive comfort of sacrifice. Each day they must declare, I will no longer betray myself in the name of love. And as they walk this path, something extraordinary happens. The cycle that once imprisoned them becomes a memory, not a fate. Resentment fades, not because wounds are forgotten, but because they no longer define the present. Love returns, not as bondage, but as freedom. And the empath, once a prisoner of their own heart, becomes its guardian, strong enough to protect, wise enough to discern, free enough to love without chains.